Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode, I'm going to be discussing what is going on in Venezuela and what the news constantly gets wrong about it. And if you're tuning in for the first time, my name is Nick Ford and I post videos about politics and what is going on in the world. So if topics like that are interesting to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss next week's episode. So Venezuela's ongoing economic and humanitarian crisis is pretty well known around the world.
We turn now to Venezuela.
Breaking right now, socialist dictator
Maduro and his regime has led the nation into a state of crisis.
But the media that's been reporting on it is entirely one-sided against Venezuela's socialist government and in support of US interests in the region. And just as a disclaimer, I absolutely do not support Venezuela's government or their president, Nicolas Maduro, and I absolutely would not want him to be the leader of my country. And there are a lot of credible reports of corruption and human rights abuses that have gone on inside the country. But there are still glaring problems that the media continues to get wrong. They constantly all paint the same picture that Nicolas Maduro is an autocratic dictator that has rigged elections and single-handedly destroyed the economy, while the valiant opposition are loved by everyone and are working for the good of the country. Now, while there might be some truth to that narrative, it's almost entirely incorrect. I first noticed the media bias against Venezuela last year when the crisis on the border was really heating up. There were reports everywhere in the news that President Maduro had instructed his military to burn humanitarian aid on the border, which is particularly evil considering the massive food and medicine shortages inside the country. But it turns out that story wasn't true. An anti-government protester had thrown a Molotov cocktail onto a truck carrying humanitarian aid, which started the fire. But the media quickly blamed that fire on Nicolas Maduro because it fitted their narrative that he was an autocratic dictator that was purposefully starving his own country. Following that, another story popped up in the media that was repeated almost everywhere. It said that Maduro had closed this bridge to block humanitarian aid into the country. Another sick and twisted thing to do during a famine. But it turns out that story wasn't true either. The bridge had always been closed because it only had just been built, and the two countries, Venezuela and Colombia, still hadn't reached an agreement on the border crossing, so it had never been opened. And only a couple of places actually reported on the correction. So after seeing all that, you kind of have to come to the conclusion that the media is actively biased against the Venezuelan government, which is much more noticeable when you look at what has gone on inside the country and what has actually been reported on. The three main falsehoods I found while researching this were the sanctions, the election, and the opposition. And the media constantly get these three wrong all the time. All too often in the media, you see these huge articles about the Venezuelan economy and how bad the crisis is, but so many of them leave out any mention of the sanctions, which are obviously a huge contributing factor. And the New York Times does this a lot. Here's an article they wrote late last year about students in Venezuela having to go to school hungry because of the food shortages. At no point throughout the entire article do they even mention the sanctions, which are obviously a massive factor. And then in this article about medicine shortages in the country, the New York Times actually says that the government blames the medicine shortages on the sanctions, but then combats that claim by saying analysts and critics claim this assertion only has some weight, which is total BS, as I'm going to explain later. Then there is also this article where the New York Times actually uses a quote from a former US State Department official saying that the sanctions haven't had much effect on the country, which is again BS. And why the hell would you use a US State Department official's opinion anyway, since their government has been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government for nearly 2 decades now? Of course, sanctions didn't cause the Venezuelan economy to crash in late 2014, but they certainly played a huge role in keeping it broken. To the fault of Venezuela's socialist leaders, Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, neither were successful in diversifying the economy, which was extremely dependent on its oil exports. So when the oil price dropped by more than half, Venezuela, like a lot of other countries, was hit extremely hard. But since the oil price crashed in 2014, prices have recovered a little bit. But now Venezuela can't recover itself because not many countries are willing to risk breaking US sanctions. The sanctions are so strict, in fact, that even companies that attempt to trade with Venezuela get sanctioned as well. Like earlier this year, a Russian company called Rosneft was trading oil in Venezuela. Now they've been targeted for sanctions as well.
The sanctions announced today target specifically the trading arm of Rosneft. It's based in Switzerland. It also targets the chairman of that particular unit. It's effectively another turn of the screw. I mean, already there's a wide array of sanctions placed by the US government on Venezuela and companies doing business, preventing them from doing business with Venezuela. But still, despite the country's oil production really a shadow of its former self, the oil that's coming out of the country, predominantly it's going to places like China and India, it's coming via Rosneft. So this is yet another attempt to try and cut that off.
And because of that, Rosneft has now completely ceased trading with Venezuela. So if not even Russian companies are willing to trade with Venezuela, can you imagine many companies that would? And that is obviously going to have a massive detrimental effect on the Venezuelan economy. And that's a fact that's very hard to overlook. Now let's talk about the medicine shortages across the country. The clip I'm about to show is an interview the Real News Network did with someone who is inside Venezuela and is tasked with purchasing HIV medicine. They say, because of the sanctions, that their bank accounts keep getting blocked and that it's nearly impossible to import the medicine that they need.
Marcel Quintana is the co-founder of the LGBT AIDS awareness group ACES Venezuela. He's also the Venezuelan who has lived the longest in the country with HIV, 33 years. He's now in charge of the distribution of antiviral meds to the country's HIV patients, something Venezuela has provided free of charge for decades. But now it's next to impossible to acquire the medicine, which is all imported.
We
understand that the Pan American Health Organization has had to change the accounts 4 times because they keep getting blocked. The blockade is not just against the government, it's against the people who are living with HIV. It's against the people living with cancer because they don't allow the medicine to come into the country. They are blocking not just the country, but the health of the people living with HIV.
And Venezuela isn't the only case. Take Iran, for example. Ever since Obama placed sanctions on Iran back in 2011, the country has been facing massive medicine shortages. Reese Erlich, a journalist that has been to Iran many times, says that the sanctions are so severe, if you want to purchase a common medicine like insulin, the only way to get it is through street vendors that act like actual drug dealers who have been able to smuggle the drug in across the border.
Most pharmaceutical products are not made in Iran. They're made in Switzerland or Europe or other places. And I went to what's called Khosrow Street, where the drug dealers hang out, but they're not selling heroin. They're selling diabetes drugs. They're selling cancer drugs and so on at incredibly inflated prices. And it's just unaffordable for most Iranians, even if they can get it. So it's high prices and very difficult to get. If you listen to the folks in Washington, they tell you that all these sanctions are targeted against leaders of the Revolutionary Guard or targeted against the political leaders who are funding or connected in some way with terrorism, and we're not targeting ordinary people. Talk to anybody in Iran, they'll give you a very different story. Of course it's targeting ordinary people.
And in the 90s, US sanctions against Iraq caused massive food and medicine shortages across the entire country, until the US finally implemented a program called Oil for Food. Only then did the US allow food and medicine back into the country. But by the time the program had been implemented, it had been estimated that up to 500,000 children had been killed because of the sanctions. But the US didn't care. Here is an interview Bill Clinton's former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, did with 60 Minutes, where she gets asked about the cost US sanctions had on Iraq.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So if US sanctions could kill up to 500,000 children in just Iraq, imagine what they're doing in Venezuela right now. Surely anyone writing about that topic would have to admit the sanctions are playing a huge role. Even UN officials have weighed in and said sanctions and economic warfare are killing civilians. Alfred de Zayas, the UN independent expert on Venezuela, presented this report to the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2018. He said the effects of sanctions imposed by Presidents Obama and Trump and unilateral measures by Canada and the European Union have directly and indirectly aggravated the shortages of medicines such as insulin and antiretroviral drugs, thus contributed to many deaths. And he even noted that foreign banks refused to process Venezuelan transactions, making it extremely difficult or even impossible for Venezuela to import medicine. And that Venezuela had even been blocked from purchasing malaria medicine from a neighboring country. So if a UN expert on Venezuela says that sanctions are blocking the country from importing medicine, people inside the country say they can't import medicine because of the sanctions, and other countries that are also under US sanctions can't import medicine either, then you kind of have to come to the conclusion that Venezuela can't import medicine because of the sanctions. So you have to ask yourself, how can the New York Times possibly come to the conclusion that analysts and critics claim this assertion only has some weight? Now, the Venezuelan presidential elections of 2018 is something the media really gets wrong. It's almost universally regarded as a rigged election. However, that's not really consistent with the facts on the ground. And there is a lot of evidence that would prove that the elections weren't rigged at all. But a lot of journalists in mainstream news just handpick bits of evidence to give the appearance that the elections were rigged. And that's fairly easy to do. So let me break this down for you. Nicolas Maduro won his first presidential election back in 2013, winning just 51% of the vote in a very close race. But then in 2018, he won with 67% of the vote, despite a huge economic and humanitarian crisis in the country. So obviously from here it looks rigged. How could Maduro's popularity go up despite the huge economic collapse and the massive protests against him? Well, that's because the opposition boycotted the elections and didn't run. They set it out claiming the elections would be rigged, so why run anyway? And if you look at the results from both elections, you'll see Maduro received over 1 million less votes in 2018 than he did in 2013. So like you would expect, his popularity did go down, but with the opposition boycotting the elections, his winning margin went up. But despite the opposition boycotting the elections, they still claim it was rigged. Well, firstly, why would you rig an election if you knew the opposition was going to boycott it? And secondly, we can't actually know if the elections were rigged or not, because the opposition forced the UN not to monitor them. Why the hell would the opposition do that? If the elections were going to be rigged, have the United Nations monitor it and prove that. You can't just sit out the elections and have no one monitor them and then claim that they were rigged without providing any evidence. But if you knew the elections weren't rigged, and you wanted to make them look like they were, you'd do exactly as the opposition have done and sit them out. And this is still the opposition's policy today. Here's an example. Lucia Newman from Al Jazeera interviewed opposition leader Juan Guaido and asked him if he was going to contest upcoming elections in Venezuela. And Guaido completely avoided the question.
What will you do if there are elections called for a new National Assembly, even if the conditions are not transparent, even if they're not fair? Will you go to those elections? Will you compete? Will you ask the opposition and the Venezuelan people to show that they are the majority?
Para tener elecciones hay algunas condiciones. Un árbitro independiente, incluso en regímenes autoritarios. Y esto ya no es un régimen autoritario electoral. Eso pasó hace mucho tiempo. Esto ya es una vulgar dictadura. Esto es un vulgar régimen que atropella y que persigue. Te voy a poner un ejemplo sencillo.
Instead of actually trying to win an election, his plan to take power is by encouraging people to take to the streets and overthrowing the government that way. In other words, a coup. Which we all know is the US's favourite method of removing socialists from power in Latin America. And Guaido even talks about the Chilean option, which is a reference to the US-backed coup in Chile in 1973, which overthrew the socialist and democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. So clearly Guaido has no plans of taking power democratically. Of course, the US also claimed the Venezuelan elections in 2018 were rigged as well. Same with the EU. But do I really need to explain how unimportant that is? Because after all, both the US and the EU supported General Sisi's presidential election in Egypt after he won something like 97% of the vote. Yeah, real believable. Or when the president of Honduras, who was losing his elections in 2017, when the voting system collapsed, and when it came back online, he was miraculously in the lead. The US nor the EU had any problem with those elections. Now, I can't say I know for sure what happened with Venezuela's presidential elections. All I'm saying is that there is a very credible argument to be made that they weren't rigged at all. But I've never seen that argument made once by anyone in any of the mainstream media organizations. Of course, critics also claim Maduro blocked anyone from running against him. And there is some truth to that, since Leopoldo Lopez and Enrique Capriles, two main opposition politicians, were blocked from running. However, Maduro still didn't run unopposed, like the elections in Egypt. Henri Falcon ran against Maduro in the presidential elections, and it probably would have been a pretty fair race if most of the opposition hadn't told their base to stay at home and boycott the vote. Now, the Venezuelan opposition is another thing the media gets wrong all the time. If you just read the news, you'd think the opposition were some well-meaning politicians trying to fix a broken system, and that they were loved and adored by the entire country. Well, that could not be further from the truth. Ken Silverstein, a journalist that has been to Venezuela many times and actually visits the poor neighborhoods, says it best. He says, while Maduro could hardly be called well-liked, Juan Guaido and the US-dominated opposition are widely reviled and rejected. Of course, Guaido does have a lot of support, but this mostly comes from wealthier, more affluent neighborhoods, whereas whenever he visits a poor neighborhood, he gets booed out.
Aquí está el pueblo revolucionario, el pueblo real de la parroquia.
¿Quién allá en esa camioneta?
Guaidó intentó entrar aquí a la parroquia, pero aquí no tiene cabida. La oposición no cabe.
Now Guaido only tours rich neighborhoods. This is because a lot of the population, and especially the poor, see Guaido as mostly a US puppet, because he does openly flaunt his relationship with the US. Like, for example, when he visited Capitol Hill at the request of Donald Trump.
Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President, please take this message back to your family.
But other than gaining some great PR in the US, it's like cancer to his image back home. Most Venezuelans still despise the US for supporting corrupt regimes in the past, and for actively supporting the 2002 coup that temporarily overthrew the country's most beloved leader, Hugo Chavez. And now, a lot of Venezuelans, rightly or wrongly, blame the US sanctions for the demise of their country. And it also doesn't help his image that he's done exactly as the US wants him to do, and actually announced publicly that he'd allow foreign companies a greater stake at exporting Venezuelan oil, and then actually advocated for more sanctions on his own country. Like, what kind of a politician does that? And of course, he claims he's the country's president despite never running in any presidential elections. Imagine if Hillary Clinton claimed that she was the US's president tomorrow, and not Donald Trump. No one would take her seriously. It's also an open secret that the US is funneling millions of dollars to support his political party. That is literally treason. What would happen if in the US they found that Russia had been funneling millions of dollars to support Trump's presidential campaign? How is this any different? A lot of Venezuelans know about Guaido's links to the US, and a lot of them despise him for it. But you don't often hear about that in the media. The media also likes to pretend that President Maduro has no supporters, which is completely incorrect. Last year, when there were massive protests against the government, thousands of the country's poor took to the streets to show their support for Nicolas Maduro and his socialist government. The reality of the situation is that you have two people that both claim to be president, Maduro and Guaido, and despite huge bases of support, both of them are pretty unpopular throughout the country. But you never see the media frame it that way. And you'll definitely never see the New York Times or the Washington Post ever talk about how seriously unpopular Guaido is, or the fact that not many Venezuelans actually want him to be president. The Venezuelan crisis is extremely complex, especially when you have the US, who used to be their biggest trading partner, is now their biggest threat. And there's no doubt the media, and the US media in particular, is extremely biased against Venezuela's socialist government. And if you want to understand why the media is so biased, I suppose you read this book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. It may have been written decades ago, but it's more relevant now than ever. And you only really need to read the first chapter to fully understand the concepts behind the media bias. So if you don't have much time, just read that. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you want to support my work and want to make a donation, there'll be a link to my PayPal account down below. And you can support in other ways by subscribing and sharing this video wherever you can. Thanks, and I'll see you again next week.